God for our greeters and our ushers. Pastor Frank Ray says that a church should never have ugly greeters. And thank God we don't have any here. He says an ugly greeter will make you leave church when you won't even hit a sermon. But thank God we don't have that problem here. We want to revisit John chapter 3, verse 16. Very, very familiar passage of scripture, but packed with so much in it. I want to ask you to just read that verse loudly together.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life.
Amen. We want to continue our study of the church evangelizing. You may be seated. The church evangelizing. As we looked at this verse on last Tuesday, we discussed the fact that cognitively believing the Via Dolorosa does not make one a Christian. I can mentally believe that there was a man who was born one day, way back then, in Bethlehem, and he went through a whole lot of stuff, and one day they decided to arrest him and crucify him, and he died, and ooh, he had so much power. He got up the third day. I believe that. And as a fact, embrace it mentally and still be lost. Because belief is more than intellectual assent. That's the reason why there's so many people who come to church, get baptized, and never grow. Because intellectually they believe it, you know, and that's not very difficult for you to believe if you've heard it all your life. You know, if you've heard all your life that next month Santa Claus is coming to town, you can believe that and be wounded when you find out it's not true. So just because you've heard something repetitively and you intellectually embrace it does not mean that you are saved by it. And so this single verse alone suggests that we must do more than just intellectually embrace it, but we must totally rely on it. One of the reasons why that phrase is so important and many people don't believe until they belong is because part of all of our spiritual growth is connected to our relationship with the covenant community. And so for those who would say, I don't have to go to church to know God and to be saved, that's true. But there is something about being in fellowship with other believers that plays a critical role in your growth or lack thereof. And so you ought not just go to church out of routine or habit, but you're going to a place where the environment, the atmosphere reflects the character of Christ. Now, how do you know if the atmosphere reflects the character of Christ? There's really only way you can know, and that is if you have a private devotion. If you know what God's presence is like when you are alone with him, then when you get to the church house, you know if that's like what you encountered at home. And so if you don't have a private devotion, then you don't know whether the Spirit of God is present at church or not. You're taking other people's words. If they start shouting, oh, the Spirit must be in here. But when you have a daily encounter with him, then you know whether or not the atmosphere is consistent with your daily encounter. And so part of building strong communities, and the community that we talk about is the community called the kingdom. A community must have a government. We've talked about that. That's what discipleship is all about. Discipling people so that they will have a mindset that resembles or even becomes eventually identical to the mindset of the King of the kingdom, who is Jesus Christ. And so then we are governed by that. And then we must have a strong community has a religion, a methodology of expressing their relationship and search for God. And then thirdly, a community must have a language. And all three of these are interdependent. You structure the religion, you structure the government based upon what you learn from your religion. You structure your politics from your theology. And so when you get your politics right, it's only because you have your theology right. But then you cannot communicate either of them if you don't have a language. Let's just look at Luke chapter 23, verse 38. We'll turn there and then turn back to John chapter 3. Luke chapter 23, verse 38. When you're there, would you say amen? Amen. Won't you read that verse together? So at the crucifixion of Jesus, Luke's account and John's account mentions that they were making such mockery of Jesus. They wanted it clearly understood that this is the one they call King of the Jews. So the superscription was written in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Greek was the language of the international culture. For us today it's English, but for them it was Greek. Latin was the language of the Roman government. And Hebrew was the language of the dominant religion. So culture, government, and religion could clearly see that this is the one they said is the King of the Jews. Now this is mass mockery because whenever you are announcing, they say he's the king and we're crucifying him, it means that we are ruling your government because we've crucified your king. But there was a language, is my point. And so with whether it was the culture, the government, or the religion, there was a language that went with it. And so the language becomes so important because through the language we are able to give definition to those things that exist. Definition is important because when you define something, you have a sense of control over it. That's why we have to be very careful not to so readily embrace other people's definitions.
All right. Amen.
One of the things we have to learn ourselves and then teach children is just because you see it on television or in a magazine does not mean you ought to imitate it.
Amen.
There was a day that every NBA player didn't have a tattoo. Now you see that almost as clearly as you see the uniform. And when that became popular, then more and more of us decided we wanted tattoos. I'm with you, Bear said, not me. Because so many, once they see something, they let what they see define what they see. A man walks into a church, kills over 20, injures another 20 more, but he's defined as having had mental health issues. Isn't that interesting? And yet, when you talk about the high Chicago homicide rate, those are criminals. And so if we let one person or one system give us our definitions, we will start allowing their definitions to control even how we see each other. Because see, if the shooter at the church had mental health issues, then he is partly a victim. So he deserves some sympathy. But if those in the hood doing the shooting are criminals, they need more policing. If it's a mental health issue, then you can't blame it on the gun. It's mental health. And so then we start recognizing that cultures give definitions so they can reinforce their cultural norms. And one of the best ways to oppress a people is to define things that reinforces your culture and empowers you in your culture, but then bring them in the culture but not allow them to profit from the culture. And any cultural norm that is not mutually benefiting to each citizen is therefore immoral. And so when we're going to start looking at what the church has to do, we've got to be prayerful and tough-minded, because we have so many issues that if we take other people's definitions, we will misdiagnose them. And that's one of the things that caused Jesus to be held in such high contempt, because the ones that the religious leaders called sinners were not the ones he called sinners. The ones who stood on their platforms of piety, pointing fingers at everybody else, he called them generation of vipers. He called them blind. He said, you are the ones that are sick. And because of him exposing them in their condition, they wanted to silence him because he was challenging their oppressive cultural norms. And so what we allow others to define, we also allow them to control. Now, faith includes embracing another person's definition. Listen to this definition and just imagine for a few seconds if John 3:16 read this way, and see how this definition would dramatically change everything you believe about God. Imagine if it read this way: God, despite his power, couldn't stop evil from killing his son. So him being unable to prevent his son's death is incapable of protecting us. Now imagine if that verse said that. That would severely damage church attendance. And there's some who would have that be the definition of what happened on Calvary. And so faith is either I'm going to accept Jesus' definition as he gave in John 3:16, or I'm going to embrace another definition. And whatever you believe is where you have exercised your faith. Our faith, however, is in the Scripture's definition of the event. The Scripture's definition is, number one, that God's love initiated, in this verse, God's love was initiated so that the world could benefit from it. So this